Hi everyone and welcome to the Festive Tech Calendar 2022 and specifically to Dong Merrily on Hybrid, where I'll walk you through a full deployment of Azure Stack HCI 22H2, dropping lots of hints along the way and showcasing how easy it is to get started. I'll even show you how to stand all this up in a sandbox environment so you can try it for yourself. I'm McSpirit, engineering technologist at Dell, focused on the Azure Hybrid technologies, Azure Stack HCI, AKS Hybrid and Azure Arc, all running on the awesome Dell integrated system for Azure Stack HCI. But enough about me, let's dive right in and get this thing deployed. So here I am in my Hybrid Jumpstart sandbox environment, and I'm actually logged into the domain controller, my management machine, where I'm actually going to be orchestrating and running through the entire deployment process of my Azure Stack HCI cluster. So let's take a look at what we've got already. So if I bring up this browser here, this Edge browser, you'll see I'm logged into the Windows Admin Center, which has been deployed previously. And before we get underway with deploying the Azure Stack HCI cluster, I just want to check something in settings. So under extensions, it's important to make sure that you can see here a long list of our different extensions that are available that we can add to Windows Admin Center. If I scroll down here, you'll see the Dell Open Manage Integration extension for Windows Admin Center. And that's really useful if you've got the awesome Dell integrated system for Azure Stack HCI. Because once you integrate and deploy that extension, it brings all of the goodness of management of your Dell hardware, the AX nodes, the Azure Stack nodes themselves, into Windows Admin Center for things like lifecycle management, integration from a compliance standpoint, and much more. So if you're running the Dell integrated system for Azure Stack HCI, make sure that you have that extension deployed and up and running, because it certainly makes life a lot easier. Now in this case, I'm running in a nested virtualization environment, so I'm not going to deploy and integrate that particular extension. But what I would urge you to do once you've checked all of the details is go over to installed extensions and make sure that all of your extensions are up to date, especially the cluster creation extension. You want to make sure that one's definitely up to date because that's what you're going to be using for the deployment of your Azure Stack HCI clusters. Now when you run through this, your version may have changed. Just make sure that that it's installed and it's up to date. There's no further updates for that particular extension. That's an important tip for you. So back to the main landing page of Windows Admin Center, we're going to add and we're going to create a new cluster. So my Azure Stack HCI nodes have already been deployed. They've actually been installed, they've been joined to the domain, there's some basic settings that have been configured, but they're not clustered, they're just individual servers at this point. So I'm going to come to this wizard and I'm going to choose to create a cluster of Azure Stack HCI, being the type. I can create standard Windows Server clusters as well. And you'll see right off the bat that I've got a choice. Do I want to create an Azure Stack HCI cluster in a single location, a single site? That's most common. Or do I want to create a single cluster that spans two locations? Those two locations could be locations in close proximity to one another, maybe two rooms in a single building, maybe two labs in a single campus. They could even be two locations geographically separated across a country or even across continents. That stretch clustering capability is built in and provides a very powerful DR and business continuity solution for you and supports things like synchronous and asynchronous replication of storage to enable and accommodate those two different scenarios, either close proximity or much further away. Either way, in this case, we're going to choose just all servers in one site, and we're going to create a small Azure Stack HCI cluster as a result of that. So we'll click Create, and we'll get through the initial settings and basics here. So there's a few things you need in advance. You need your Windows Admin Center to be set up, and we've got that up and running already. We need at least a couple of servers to deploy with Windows Admin Center. Azure Stack HCI does support a single node cluster, just not with Windows Admin Center yet at the time of recording. Azure Stack HCI has been installed on each node, so that was something we did ahead of time, and we've got the relevant credentials, relevant prereqs set up in Azure, and which we'll go through in a little bit more detail later on as well. And we've worked with our networking team, in this case that's me, to make sure that all the networking setup is ready to go in terms of switches and back-end infrastructure required to connect out to Azure. In my case, all of this is in a sandbox, so some of that didn't really apply, but it's important if this was production, you make sure you meet all of those prerequisites. So let's proceed on. Now that we know that we've got all of those prereqs that have been met, we can go on and make sure we go through the rest of the process to handle this deployment. So firstly, we need to tell Windows Admin Center where all of these servers that we're going to transform into this cluster are. So I'm going to provide some credentials. Very secure password. It's not password. It's not password 123. It's a bit more secure than that. And we're going to search for the names of our nodes that we're going to cluster. Now in this case, you want to make sure that your DNS resolution is operating. Alternatively, you can specify the IP addresses as well. So that's also an option when you come to deploy. And you'll see that it's validating the first node, and as we add the second, once it finds it, then we can proceed on and validate that second node. And that normally takes a few minutes. Obviously, if you've got lots of nodes, that's going to take a few minutes more. But in this case, it shouldn't take long at all. You'll see it's detected the Azure Stack HCI OS. The model of hardware in this case is virtual machine. This is running in a nested virtualization environment. But if this was on a physical system in production, you would expect to see your manufacturer and the model of your particular nodes being used there. Now, as I said earlier, when I deployed these Azure Stack HCI nodes, they were joined to the domain at that time, but Windows Admin Center can take care of that for you as well. That's a useful piece of information and useful feature of Windows Admin Center's deployment. Now, in this case, we also need to install some features on the Azure Stack HCI nodes themselves. With this being a nested environment, I've already installed the Hyper-V role because that can be a bit fiddly in nested virtualization, and Windows Admin Center doesn't always make that the easiest of processes. So I've done that ahead of time. If you're using my sandbox as well, yours will automatically be installed as well. But Windows Admin Center can handle installing all of the other necessary roles like data deduplication, BitLocker, DCB, clustering, network ATC that we'll use shortly, Hyper-V and AD modules for PowerShell. All of those things are important for the deployment of an Azure Stack HCI cluster, but they're not installed by default. So clicking the install features and waiting a few minutes, which will speed up for the purposes of the demo, that's important. And you can't proceed on until all of those necessary components are installed and ready to use. So now that that's done, we can optionally, if there are updates available, install updates for the Azure Stack HCI nodes at this stage. So you've got a choice. Do I do it now and get ahead of the curve, or do I wait, and once deployment and all of the clustering and everything is set up, I could experience the lifecycle management of the Azure Stack HCI cluster using Windows Admin Center and apply the updates in that way. So I can see how, being a cluster, the update process is handled. It's really up to you. You can apply them here or you can apply them later. I'm going to leave them for now, but that's something you could investigate later on if you like as well. So we'll leave it for now because that does take a few minutes, and we'll go next. Now at this stage, if this was actual hardware, so if you're running this on hardware and your OEM of choice, which I hope is Dell, has a plugin for Windows Admin Center, ours being the OpenManage extension for Windows Admin Center, what you can do here is also orchestrate the updating, the installation of any specific drivers and firmware for your particular integrated system, your Azure Stack HCI environment. And remember, this is unique to physical environments. So in which case, what's going to happen there is, in the case of Dell, the OpenManage integration will coordinate with Windows Admin Center to install any necessary firmware drivers and other updates to the devices in your physical systems to ensure that when you deploy this and create this cluster, it's really doing that on a solid foundation with the latest validated hardware configurations from a drivers and firmware perspective. So really useful integration, and doing it at this stage ensures that you're fully compliant and up to date and ready to go when the workloads start to land on the platform. So with that out of the way, we can move on to an important step. Now that we've installed some features, potentially some updates and so on, you want to make sure that you're ready to, in this case, restart the nodes. So it's identified that these nodes need rebooting. So we'll kick that off and we'll accelerate that process a little bit because that can take a few minutes, especially if these were physical servers. That might take a few minutes to bounce those boxes. But in this case, being nested virtual machines, it doesn't take too long at all. So once they're back online, everything's verified, and within just a few moments, we are back online and ready to go. And now we're at the point where we have to make an important choice. Do we use the new and exciting network ATC to deploy and manage our networking, which, as you can see, is recommended, or do we choose our manual configuration to essentially let us fully configure and define the host networking? So let's quickly compare and contrast these two options. Manual configuration has been the way to configure Azure Stack HCI networking since the initial release and gives you full control of the network configuration. You define the network settings on a node by node basis, configuring complex settings around things like QoS, SMB Direct, VLANs, vSwitches and more, which is great from a control perspective, but it can be time consuming. It can be error prone and it has to be repeated as and when you add additional nodes to your cluster. In addition, if someone sneaky, like say the Grinch or one of Santa's overworked elves, logs in and tinkers with your network config, it could cause significant issue. And there's no automatic detection or remediation. You've got to react and fix things as best you can. Network ATC, on the other hand, simplifies the deployment and network configuration for Azure Stack HCI clusters. And it provides something called an intent-based approach to host network deployment. Now, if you're not sure what an intent is, it's a definition of how you intend to use the physical adapters in your system. An intent has a friendly name, it identifies one or more physical adapters and includes one or more intent types, which we'll see a bit later. Now, by specifying one or more intents, which includes management, compute, or storage, for example, for a physical network adapter, you can automate the deployment of the intended configuration. So, not only does Network ATC help to reduce host network and deployment time, as we'll see, complexity and errors, but it's also going to help you adhere to the latest and ever-evolving validated and supported best practices. It also ensures consistency across the whole cluster, including when new nodes are added to the cluster. And finally, it helps to eliminate configuration drift, so keeps the Grinch and the sneaky elves at bay. So in our case, we're going to choose the new and exciting Network ATC, and that customizes the wizard from this point forward to reflect that choice. So you'll see we're doing some discovery of the network, the physical network adapters in the system. So identifying their speed, their names and other important properties. And you'll see here that it's identified 4 NICs. And these 4 NICs are Ethernet 2, 3 and 4. And these are named universally on each of our 2 Azure Stack HCI nodes. So these are common across our nodes. So that's going to be an important consideration when you are deploying for the first time, that your network adapters have matching names across the different nodes in your cluster. They have the same interface and have matching names, interface descriptions, and link speeds. So those are all important factors. Now, once we have those in place, we can then start to go through and define our intents. If you're finding that your network adapters aren't aligning up and appearing in this list, you might want to go back at this point or query the node directly and make some amendments to the names of the network adapters to ensure that they do map and align appropriately across your different nodes in the cluster, because that consistency is important to establish up front. So now that ours are all lined up, we can define our intents. And remember what we said previously, our intents are, we would like these physical NICs to be used in this way. And when I say this way, I mean for management purposes, i.e. letting our hosts communicate with one another and other pieces of infrastructure on the network. I want them to be used for compute, i.e. the virtual machines running on this set of hosts, this cluster. They need to be able to use these physical adapters to communicate out. Or these adapters should be used for storage. Now it could be that you have just a small number of adapters, let's say 2 adapters in this physical host. And those adapters could be 10 gig, maybe 40 gig is more preferable, even 100 gig, even higher. But let's use 100 gig as an example. Now, if you've only got 2 NICs, but you need to divide up the types of traffic in multiple ways, management, which needs to be isolated from the VM traffic, which needs to be isolated from storage, and you've only got 2 NICs and you want to make it redundant, how are you going to do that? Well, with Network ATC, it automates and orchestrates the creation of things like set switches for redundancy and aggregation and communication for VMs. It isolates traffic from management, compute, storage through the use of host vNICs, VLANs, quality of service, and more. And it does all of that in a very automated manner. So let me walk you through quickly how easy it is to start to define these intents and then apply them to, in our case, our 4 network adapters. So let's have a look at my configuration here. So we'll go over to, firstly, our traffic types. And you'll see we've got compute, storage, and management as I described. And in our case, I'm going to use my first two network adapters, two physical network adapters for both compute and management. So that means our hosts are going to share these two physical NICs and the bandwidth available to them with the virtual machines that are running on these nodes as well. So those two 10 gig adapters, those first two adapters, in which case I'm going to choose Ethernet and Ethernet 2. And remember, because they're the same across both of our nodes, it's going to apply universally across the nodes. And they're going to be used for compute and management. Management being the host communication, compute being the guest, the virtual machine workloads. And you'll see when we go into this additional settings menu here and we expand the virtual switch, you can see we can turn on advanced features like SRIOV, choose our load balancing, which ideally you should just leave on the default, and enable things like jumbo frames if we want and change the size, the frame size there. You'll notice some of the settings are disabled. That's because we're running in a nested environment, but if this was a physical environment, you may choose to enable some of those. So I'm going to leave all of those default settings as they are. They're fine for my sandbox. And I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to add a second intent. Because remember, in my environment, I've got two additional network adapters that I'm going to dedicate for storage. And so in this case, I'm going to choose storage. The intent name is going to stay as storage. And I'm going to dedicate Ethernet 3 and Ethernet 4 to that particular intent. And in this case, we're not going to create additional virtual network adapters for storage. We're going to leave things as they are, and we're going to essentially utilize those physical network adapters to the fullest, but use the intent to automate the configuration of those adapters. So that's an important characteristic there. So you'll see the wizard is a little bit different in terms of those advanced settings now for storage specifically. It's got data center bridging options for us, which helps to establish traffic priorities for different types of traffic in respect of these storage networks, and we can set bandwidth reservations as well. In addition, if I go into the adapter properties here, you'll see, similar to what we saw before, changing that jumbo frame size. Probably more preferable on a storage network adapter, but in addition, those RDMA settings grayed out. Those are definitely something you would advise to use on your storage network adapters in a physical environment, so make sure you have those configured. In my case, they're disabled because this is a nested virtualization environment. So with those intents defined, it's as simple as that. I want these NICs to be used for compute and management, these to be used for storage. And there's a few final settings that need to be provided, in particular for storage network. You'll see that at the top there, the two network adapters that we've dedicated to storage, Ethernet 3 and 4, we've made some assumptions and we've made some pre-configuration decisions here that they will be VLAN with 711 and 712 for those respective adapters across both nodes. So both Ethernet 3 on node 1 and 2 will have VLAN 711. Ethernet 4 on node 1 and 2 will have 712. And then from there, we need to address these warning messages that we've got where we need to change the IP addresses on some of these or all of these adapters, because they've just inherited the default IP addresses when we deployed the Azure Stack HCI nodes the first time. So they've just grabbed a load of DHCP addresses on the same subnet. Not ideal. So we want to make sure that we're updating those to be on different subnets across the different VLANs. So in this case, Ethernet 3 will put on the 10.71.1 subnet within VLAN 711, and Ethernet 4 across both nodes will be on the 10.71.2 subnet within VLAN 712. And you'll see by completing that, all of our error messages and warnings disappear. So we can go next in clustering. So that's as far as our network configuration needs to be done, or needs to be taken. Now we will start the creation of the cluster. So in this case, we just need to give the cluster object a name. I'm going to keep it highly original with Azure Stack HCI cluster. We're not going to use a static IP. We're going to use DHCP. All the networks are available in these advanced settings, and I'm going to go ahead and create the cluster. Simple as that. Very quick and very easy. And that will normally take a few moments. You'll see it kicks into a slightly different blade in a moment once that process continues. Here we go. So the creation has started, and we'll accelerate through this a little bit for demo purposes, but that'll just take a few minutes to create that cluster object. So making sure you've got the right permissions in Active Directory to do that is going to be important. You'll see that cluster has now been created. We're just verifying the domain name, and we can communicate in that way, in the correct way. That's going to be an important step for communicating with the cluster. You may be prompted, depending on your user account, for credentials to be able to validate that DNS and connect to the cluster. So just provide those, and I always tick the box to use the credentials for all connections. And you see things are proceeding on nicely there. So we'll verify that node DNS resolution, and everything's green and good. So you'll notice here as well that it gives us a little piece of advice here that we should create a cluster witness once we're finished with this wizard. Now, a cluster witness is an integral part of achieving quorum for a cluster, and is in particular importance when you've got an even number of nodes within your cluster. So we'll walk through creating a cluster witness a bit later on once we get a little bit further through the process. So for now, we will click Next. And we're about to actually deploy the network settings. So we created the cluster object, we've taken all of the extents, the intents and the existing network configuration that we defined earlier, and you'll see that it's aggregated that into this view. We're going to deploy compute and management intent across those two nodes, and a storage intent across the same two nodes. And so by clicking deploy, that process is going to kick off, and that will actually take a few minutes. So we've accelerated this a little bit to streamline the process. You'll see it's starting to provision those network settings now, so deploy those desired states for our network adapters, IP addresses, VLANs and more. And we go on to validation of the cluster now. So that network settings config was so straightforward, and it allows us to move on to validate the configuration. If anything was incorrect at this stage in terms of network communication, when we run this validation, we would get the errors. We would get the report that says, can't communicate via this network path. These nodes can't reach one another. So that's why we do the host networking first, then we validate what we've done, because we can always go back at this stage and make changes. So now that that's completed, we can view the report if we want to, and you'll see here, if I open that particular cluster report, we'll see that it's queried things like the BIOS and server system config and more, and the network configuration. Everything is green, so we are good to go. Onto storage. If this is a completely new system with no previous deployments on it, you can safely erase the drives and clean things out before proceeding. If, however, this is a system where you've perhaps you're overwriting, you've re-imaged the nodes, the OS drives, but you're overwriting the previous cluster, and you want to keep the storage pools that were there previously, don't erase the drives, because we'll be able to import them and use them later on. Okay, so make your choice. In this case, I'm going to erase these drives because they're not necessary for me. They're clean. I just want to make sure everything's clean and ready to go. So we'll click erase. Yeah, you're about to erase everything, all the data. Yep, great. And once that's done, we can proceed on and move forward with nice clean drives ready to accept and being included in our new storage pool as part of the deployment of the storage layer. So in this case, we can confirm what drives we've got. In a nested environment, they're just going to all show up as generic drives, but in a real environment, you'll see NVMEs, SSDs, hard drives, and more with more information. We're going to validate and check that storage spaces direct, which is our hyperconverged storage technology, can be enabled. In this case, everything's good. I'm not going to download the report on this occasion. And so we're just going to go ahead and enable storage spaces direct. And storage spaces direct is going to transform all of those raw physical disks that are within the Azure Stack HCI nodes into resilient, high-performance storage that's ready for your workloads. So all of that plumbing is under the covers with Azure Stack HCI, but really enables you to run real high-performance workloads at great scale, but at real cost efficiency as well. So with that enabled, as you've seen, it's really straightforward. We're not going to choose to enable software-defined networking in this particular demonstration. It does add a little bit more time and complexity to the configuration. We don't need it for what we're doing. So I'm going to skip that step, and we're going to just proceed on to taking a look at our cluster and start with some of the more advanced configuration. So let's click into our cluster. And while things load up the dashboard, you can see not much going on here. Everything looks pretty clean. Everything's pretty fresh. You'll notice that we haven't registered our Azure Stack HCI cluster, and that's an important part of the deployment process. Once you've created the cluster, you need to connect it to Azure. So you need connectivity to Azure, you need to be able to register that cluster, and you'll need the appropriate credentials in order to register that cluster with Azure. So we'll take a look at that shortly. Now before we register, let's take a look down here. We see that all of the useful dashboards are there. Nothing too populated at this point because everything's pretty fresh and new. Let's go into settings and let's review some of the settings here. So firstly with the storage spaces and pools, so that's software-defined storage technology. You'll see that within this view we can make some amendments to some of the settings we have for Storage Spaces Direct in this Azure Stack HCI cluster. So we can rename the pool, we can change the version, we can change the default provisioning type from fixed provisioning, where if I want a 50 terabyte or 50 gigabyte volume, I'll create that in 50 gigabyte or more in the case of a mirrored drive will be consumed, so the full amount will be consumed at deployment or creation time. Or I can thin provision my drives by default, where we'll create a volume of 50 gigabytes, but a smaller amount will be consumed off the bat and will grow into that maximum size. So nothing too new for storage people there in terms of the differences between thin and fixed provisioning, but it's nice to have those capabilities built in and available to us within Windows Admin Center here. And when we look through some more of the settings here, we can change and tweak some of the caching, some of the sizes, some of the mechanisms for caching. And if you're not familiar, Storage Spaces Direct incorporates caching automatically when you have different drive types. So if you have spinning disk and a mix of SSD, then it's going to use the fastest drives for the cache. If you have SSD and NVMe, it's going to use the fastest drive for the cache. If you have all flash, then it's not. It's just going to use all of that for capacity. But it will automatically judge and decide and implement the best fit for your workloads or your storage types based on what it detects within the storage configuration that you've provided within those disks. So if we look at the properties of the cluster, you'll see some useful information: name, domain name, IP address. Also another reminder that we've not set up a witness for the cluster, so that's an important step we're going to have to carry out soon. And we can see useful information around the operating system, the hardware itself, albeit this is, again, nested virtualization, so we're seeing just virtual machine hardware. Under host settings, this is a setting that often catches people out, because by default, the cluster setting for where you would like to store virtual machines and their accompanying virtual hard disks are within folders on the local C drives of the nodes, which, as you can imagine, if you drop all of your files onto one of the node's C drives, then should that node be unavailable for whatever reason, that workload is unavailable. It needs to be stored on shared storage so that the config file, all of the necessary VM settings and files, and the virtual hard disks of the virtual machines are on shared storage such that they can be accessed and utilized by all nodes in the cluster. So we need to make a change for that, but we'll address that in a few moments. In addition, you'll see settings for live migration, storage migration, lots of Azure related settings as well, which we'll explore a bit later on. But for now, we'll go ahead and let's go over to our volumes view and let's make that change because we need to create a volume first that we can then assign as the default for VM creation locations. So we'll go create, and in this case, I'm just going to keep a lot of the defaults. It's a 2-node cluster, so we'll use two-way mirror. I'll use 50 gigabytes of storage for this volume. I can choose thin or fixed provisioning. In this case, I'm going to use thin. Change it to fixed if I like. I'll use thin. And from there, I could turn on encryption or some more of the advanced settings, but I'm just going to go ahead and click create. And that's going to go ahead and create that volume. That's going to take just a moment or two. And once that's complete, there we go, that one's created. So I'll quickly refresh this view, and there it is. So now if I dig into this volume, I can turn on some more of the advanced features like dedupe, BitLocker encryption. You'll see there's a 50 gig volume, 100 gig on the disk because of the two-way mirror. And if we go back to settings now, remember that host setting that I told you catches a lot of people out? Let's go to that setting. Let's update this path here. And this is cluster wide, so we set this once and it does it for all the nodes in your cluster. We'll go up to the C drive, we'll choose cluster storage, which is the entry point for our shared storage. Volume 1's the volume we just created. And let's create a new virtual machine on this particular, new virtual machine folder for the virtual hard disks and for the VMs themselves. So let's choose VMs. There we go. So we've created two new folders, and I'll provide those. So you'll see I'm going to tick the box for VHDs here for the storage of the virtual disks path. And I'm going to select and copy and paste that and change that to VMs. There we go, and we'll save that. So easy stuff, but what you've seen there is an important setting that catches a lot of people out. Then we have the witness, the quorum witness that's used, incredibly important, especially when you have an even number of nodes within your Azure Stack HCI cluster. So you want to make sure you're setting up the witness that provides the third vote, in this case, for my 2-node cluster. Should it encounter issues and have any node outages, this becomes very important, or even when there's maintenance. You've got 2 choices. You can use the witness being in the cloud, so in an Azure storage account, which we're going to show, or you can drop this on a file share. And it's a tiny amount of data, a tiny, tiny piece of information, but it just provides enough of a mechanism and a vote for allowing you to fully configure the quorum for this cluster. So in this case, I'm going to choose the cloud witness. You'll see it needs a storage account name, an account key that's unique to that storage so that it can authenticate, and the endpoint. So how's it going to reach that storage, in which case it's a public endpoint. So I'm going to log into Azure, in this case, portal.azure.com. I'm going to go to storage accounts and I'm going to create a new storage account. And you only need the most basic of basic settings. So here I'm going to give it a name, festive storage 001. Thankfully that's not been taken. And I'm going to choose locally redundant storage. I don't need this to be GRS, just local's fine. I'm going to review. And I'm going to go ahead once that's completed and create. Now you can turn on and tweak some of the more advanced settings if you want. So please go through the docs and check that out. But for my purposes, I'm just going to create a simple storage account. And it's going to cost pennies, if that, on a yearly basis. It's incredibly small usage for this particular storage account. So that deployment is going to take a few moments. You'll see it's underway. And that's completed, so not much to it. So let's go to that resource, and we need to go down to the access keys. And this is where we grab the storage account name if you don't remember it already. We want to check out our key here. So if we go to show, you'll see there's our storage key. Nobody's stealing that, please. No, I've already changed it, so don't worry. But you grab that key, throw that in the Windows Admin Center view here. Type in the name that we allocated earlier. And we just need that Azure Service Endpoint as well. Now you may know it already. If you do, great. But if you don't, you can copy this, drop this into Notepad, and the endpoint is right at the end here. So you can see core.windows.net. So we will grab that, and we will come out of there. And if you can't remember core.windows.net, just paste it in. There you go. And so when you save, if you've got anything wrong here, it's going to tell you. But hopefully, if you've done it all correctly, what you should see is that witness setting gets correctly applied and you are online and ready to go. And so mine just takes a moment. There we go, online, success. And what you've got there now is a witness, which helps you achieve quorum for your Azure Stack HCI cluster. Great for edge locations, great for not needing any additional infrastructure, all good. And that's been configured now as a cloud witness. As I said, you could use the file share witness as well. So back on the dashboard, we do still need to register Azure Stack HCI cluster. That's an important step. So to do that, I'm going to come into Azure Stack HCI registration here. I could have clicked it from the dashboard as well, but I'm going to do it from here. And what I need to do is register this cluster to make sure I have full functionality and comply with the service terms. So if I click register, it's going to attempt to log me in. In this case, it's going to use this particular user, this AZS HCI user at my tenant, use this particular subscription. I'm going to create a new resource group in Azure to hold the registration object for this Azure Stack HCI cluster. So I'm going to call this the very original AZS HCI cluster and put this in East US in terms of my region. And I'm going to choose to enable Azure Arc, which is going to give me the full gamut of functionality as I go forward for the cluster itself and workloads as I go forward as well. So definitely an important step. It's optional, but it is encouraged. And if you need to know the permissions before I do register this particular cluster, you might be thinking, well, what does my user need in order to actually do this? Well, in this case, I'm logged in as that user. And if I click on View My Access, you'll see that this particular user on the subscription itself has contributor rights and the user access administrator rights, which are the bare minimum in terms of existing roles that I can use to enable both the registration of the Azure Stack HCI cluster and the integration with Azure Arc. If you want to create a custom role with a very specific permissions, you can do that against the subscription as well. You've got options there as well, and that's all in the documentation. So I'm going to use those built-in roles. That makes it easy for me. I don't have to be an owner, and I'll click on register, and that's going to orchestrate that process. It does take a few minutes, especially when you integrate with Azure Arc. There's agents that get turned on and enabled and integrated. They're native to Azure Stack HCI. So that will take a few minutes. And once that's complete, you'll see that the Azure Stack HCI cluster is showing us completely registered. It's integrated. Everything was connected successfully. And the Arc integration, green is good. We're all looking in good shape there as well. So we've got 60 days from the registration as a free trial before we build. And if I go home here, and I'll type in Azure Stack HCI to find the dedicated Azure Stack HCI resource provider. I'll close these little wizards here. And if I look at this particular cluster specifically and minimize some of these extra views, what you see is that I'm connected, all of the information, the number of physical cores across my cluster, the build I'm running, the subscription that's this particular cluster has been registered to is all available. And I can then start to look at how I can extend the functionality of my Azure Stack HCI system to take advantage of some of the Azure capabilities specifically. So you can see right off the bat here, Auto Manage for Windows Server, Azure Virtual Desktop. These are scenarios, capabilities that are exposed to me and available to me for use now that I've integrated this Azure Stack HCI cluster with Azure. If I look at, in the case of looking at my nodes in particular, you can see that my 2 nodes are listed there. I can see information about them, the manufacturer, the model, the size, the shape, etc. And if I've got lots of clusters, I can aggregate a lot of this information into one view. Under capabilities, I can see that I can enable things like log analytics, insights, so I can get deeper visibility and monitoring into my cluster or clusters. And I can also choose to deploy Windows Admin Center in Azure and connect it to my Azure Stack HCI cluster without VPN, without a direct connection. So instead of using the Windows Admin Center that's on-prem that we were using before, I could actually elevate that to use that in the cloud, which could give me some useful scenarios for different use groups as well. So in this case, I've not enabled all of those. That's something you could go on and build upon once you're more comfortable. But in this case, I'm just going to get us started by finishing off the registration and moving on from there. So we've got our Azure Stack HCI cluster successfully registered. We can see it in the portal. We can go on and explore this additional functionality around monitoring, around additional settings and more. But I want to head back to the Windows Admin Center for a few moments just to review some final settings. So let's head back to where we were before. And I want to first look at monitoring. So if I do choose to integrate with log analytics for monitoring, how frequently you push your data to Azure, this can be configured here as well. So that's an important option. From a service health, we've got the service level setting as basic for now, but we can choose to adjust that if we want. I can join the preview channel if I like as well. So if I'm not content with running the very latest 22H2 release and I want to go even further ahead, now definitely not for production use, but I can choose to turn that on and experience some of the additional new capabilities coming in the future version of Azure Stack HCI. Now in addition, I can also turn on something called Azure Benefits. Now, if you're not familiar, Azure offers a range of differentiated workloads and capabilities that are designed to run only on Azure. Azure Stack HCI extends many of the same benefits you get from Azure while running on the same familiar and high-performance on-prem or edge environments. Now, Azure Benefits makes it possible for supported Azure exclusive workloads to work outside of the hyperscale public cloud. And best of all, you can enable Azure Benefits on Azure Stack HCI at no extra cost. But what are the specific Azure Benefits? Well, firstly, there's the Windows Server Data Center Azure Edition, an operating system, which is an Azure-only guest OS available to run on Azure Stack HCI that includes all the latest Windows Server innovations, things like hot patching and other exclusive features. Then, there's the free Extended Security Updates, or ESUs, through Azure Stack HCI. This allows customers to continue to get security updates for end of support SQL Server and Windows Server VMs, and now free when running on Azure Stack HCI. And then finally, there's the Azure Policy Guest Configuration, which can help audit or configure OS settings as code for both host and guest machines running on HCI. All very useful, I'm sure you agree. And as you can see, this is straightforward to turn on, just a single button. I configure a few settings and I'm away, and I can benefit from all those things we just talked about. There's a streamlined way of activating Windows Server virtual machines on Azure Stack HCI if you want to take advantage of that rather than use things like KMS. I can integrate my activation with Azure Stack HCI's OS itself. I can choose to enable VM self-service for deployment of VMs from the Azure portal against this Azure Stack HCI cluster. That's a really powerful feature, and all I need to do is deploy some additional components, what's known as a resource bridge, onto this Azure Stack HCI cluster, and some Azure CLI extensions on my nodes. And once that's deployed and my prerequisites are met, I can then start to take advantage of in-Azure VM deployments against my Azure Stack HCI cluster, including the use of an Azure Marketplace for curated images. And that will appear in our Azure Stack HCI view here in the resource provider once that's enabled. So that's all awesome stuff. So what you've seen there is how easy it is to deploy an Azure Stack HCI cluster, configure the networking, the storage, run through a few initial settings, integrate with Azure, start to look and explore and potentially turn on some of the more advanced Azure integration features like the Azure benefits and the VM self-service and VM deployment. You've seen how easy it is. I urge you to go on and check out more of the resources to continue your learning. But if you're thinking, well, how can I deploy this environment? I haven't got any hardware. What are my options here? What did you do for this sandbox environment? Well, if I flip over to my particular sandbox environment here, you'll see it's running his Hyper-V Manager, a number of VMs, 2 nodes, a domain controller and a Windows Admin Center machine running on my local Hyper-V host, so using nested virtualization. And I deployed those. I'll show you if I quickly log into my domain controller here using VM Connect. So I'll let that spin up and go full screen. I'll log in with my appropriate credentials. There we go. Again, not password 14123. Let's minimize that bar there. And if I look at GitHub, at github.com/Dell/Geos/hybrid jumpstart, you'll find lots of useful resources there, particularly focused on Azure Stack HCI and deploying some of these different building blocks and components of the overall hybrid solution. But if you want to get tactical specifically and you don't have any physical hardware, you can deploy this in Azure inside a single virtual machine. So you'll see your nested hosts, you'll see information about sizing and costs of running this over a period of time, which is really useful, and a link to deploy through a templatized deployment as well, all in Azure. So a lot of automated process there. In about 30 or 40 minutes, you'll be ready to actually start running through the process we've just gone through there. If you have got physical hardware, you can obviously use that as well. And there's some useful, simple scripts to deploy this on your own physical system. And that's what I used as well. So that brings us to the end of the demo. So I hope you all found that useful. As you can see, deploying Azure Stack HCI is quick and it's easy. And with the continued improvements that we see release on release, combined with the innovation in Azure Arc, it's clear that Azure Stack HCI is the best platform for hybrid. And I urge you to try it out for yourself by heading over to the Hybrid Jumpstart. So with that, thanks for watching and happy holidays.